public an opportunity to address the school board. Community input is encouraged and welcome. Input must be informational in nature and address the entire board rather than one particular board member. The Board of Education cannot engage in discussion or debate, but will take the information for review and direct to the appropriate district employee to respond. Oh, and welcome, just in time. Come on forward.
Drives our
The time is 6:34 p.m. The Board of Education meeting will be live streamed via our district YouTube channel. Viewing information can be found on the district website. Our mission is to provide a safe and caring climate and culture in which we engage, inspire, educate, prepare, and empower all learners in partnership with their surrounding community to be successful in today's and tomorrow's society. Zach, can you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Sorry, teacher, I forgot to spit off the phone. Gotcha.
And then can you please call roll?
The following board members are present at the District Administration Office. Scott Andreessen.
Here.
Natalie Copeland.
Here.
Al Dahlgren. Here. Zach Dorhold is here. Shannon Haas.
Here.
And Heather Weems.
Here.
And following board members are not present today, Monica Segura Sports. The following cabinet members and staff are present at the District Administration Office. Superintendent Dr. Lori Putnam, Assistant Superintendent of Secondary Education Dr. Jason Harris, Assistant Superintendent of PK5 Education Nikki Hansen, Assistant Superintendent of E12 Education Services Dr. Mike Rivard, Executive Director of Community Education Adam Holm, Executive Director of Finance and Business Services Amy Scalarud, Executive Director of Human Resources and Labor Relations Tracy Flynn Bowe, Executive Director of Operations Gary Ganji, Executive Director of Research Enrollment and Assessments Donna Roper, Media Technicians Paul Novak and Gordy Scott, and custodian on site is Evan Voss.
Thank you. Then I'm looking for a motion for our Board of Education meeting and work session agenda.
So move.
And do I have a second?
Second.
I have a motion by Scott, a second by Zach. Zach, can you call vote?
Heather Weems.
Yes.
Shannon Haas.
Yes.
Zach Dorles, yes. Al Dahlgren.
Yes.
Natalie Copeland.
Yes.
Scott Andresen.
Yes.
Thank you. Then we have the consent agenda. The consent agenda consists of non-controversial items that the board adopts routinely without debate. Any single member may remove an item from the consent agenda by requesting removal at the time the consent agenda is moved for adoption. On tonight's consent agenda, item A, approval of personnel staff changes. Item B, approval of monthly financial report for April 2024. Item C, approval of monthly treasurer's report for April 2024. Item D, approval of board policy 606.5, library materials, third reading. And item E, approval of board policy 708, transportation of non-public school students as revised, third reading. At this time, does any board member wish to remove an item from the consent agenda? Then I'm looking for a motion to approve the consent agenda as read.
So move.
And do I have a second?
Second.
I have a motion by Scott, a second by Heather. Zach, can you call vote?
Al Dahlgren.
Yes.
Natalie Copeland.
Yes.
Scott Andresen.
Yes.
Heather Weems.
Yes.
Shannon Haas.
Yes.
Zach Dorles, yes.
Thank you. All right, first up, we have one informational item tonight. We have Summer Facilities Project Update presented by Gary Ganji, Executive Director of Operations.
That uncomfortable silence there. All right. Good evening, Chair Haas, Superintendent Putnam, and members of the Board of Education. This evening, we are providing you with some information regarding summer building projects. We are fortunate that we got an early start this year due to the nice weather in the spring, and we've already made some significant progress on some of these projects. All right, let's talk playgrounds. Both Westwood and Katherine Johnson Education Center playgrounds have been discussed in the past. As you recall, many schools across the country use their ESSER funds to purchase playground equipment. This plus the labor shortage, supply chain challenges coming out of the pandemic, and the abbreviated installation window in this Minnesota climate has kept these projects on our list for the past year and a half. I am very happy tonight to report that these are underway. If you've driven by Katherine Johnson Education Center, the playground is installed. And the Westwood project should be completed in the first part of summer. The Westwood project is a partial replacement, and the Katherine Johnson project is a new playground, as it's a new facility. At Katherine Johnson, you'll also see a new fence around the playground, with the Foundry parking lot being directly to the north. It was a safety need, and that was installed as well. All right, outdoor facilities. If you've driven by south, you'll see a new backstop fence on a softball field there as part of the field reconfiguration there. They needed to be moved, and I drove by that last night with the rain on it, and it just sparkled. It looks good. The Apollo tennis courts were recently resurfaced. That included restriping two of the courts on the eastern half for pickleball. That's been the standard across the district as pickleball's gained popularity. If you're walking around, you see little orange dots on cement around the district. That means there's going to be some cement repair work. And as you came in tonight, you probably saw it here. Earlier this spring, we had a sewer backup over at North. We need to go back in and kind of finish that job. It was a quick repair because it was over the weekend. Any buildings built around 1970 or prior to that have clay pipes. They deteriorate. North was built in the 1960s, so we need to go in and put a liner in there. And then the DAO is having two roof exhaust fans. If you go out the door and you see they don't quite close all the way because of the air pressure, that should resolve that. And McKinley, if you've driven by there, it's starting to look like a construction zone. The addition is underway. This will include 4 additional classrooms, 2 small group areas, and an additional additional restrooms and a separate entrance for the new programming in that wing. The home-like toilet rooms project in the existing building will be part of the scope of work this summer. As you recall, we had some permitting issues last year and just ran out of time. We aren't immune to permitting delays for the new addition. There's been some permitting delays, and so completion of that project will probably be in the October timeframe, but we will be able to start school. The remodeling of the existing restrooms is scheduled to be completed prior to the start of the school year. Apollo, if you've driven by there, its parking lot is just full of materials. Apollo's going to see a lot of work this summer. The auditorium will have seating upgrades and modifications. It'll have sound and lighting enhancements, some rigging replacement, and some accessibility modifications. And on all of these projects, we look at them and it's about stuff. It's about construction. And I just want to pause on this one to talk about. It's really not about the stuff. It's about the students. I just want to point out a couple things about this particular portion of the project. The Apollo Auditorium, actually that picture looks pretty good, but it needs some work. Somewhere in the past 50 plus years, the stage was added onto. When the stage was added onto, the lighting was not reconfigured. And so staff that work with students talk about the lava line. And it took us a while to figure out what they were talking about. But there is a section of the stage that you can't light. And so when they do productions or do any work with students, they have to avoid that area. So that's one thing that's going to be resolved. The auditorium, or the current state of it, we can't have the middle level bands, north side, south side. We can't have them perform there. There isn't enough space. Through these renovations, we'll be able to do that. And Principal Skullroot is really excited about that kids get that experience before they get to Apollo. There'll be things installed like a intercom system between backstage and the booth. That's what real auditoriums and stages have. So students will have that real experience of production. In the way it's configured now with the control booth up some steps, there's an accessibility issue. It'll be reconfigured so that we can move the equipment down if needed for an accommodation so all students can participate. Along with that, there'll be upgrades for LED lighting, more accessibility, and if you've been in there for any production, when someone opens the door, you get that flood of light, and that's going to be corrected. There'll be a buffer between that, and so it will really be a much better experience for students. So although we talk about seats and lights and all that, it really is about the instruction. All right. Also at Apollo, we'll continue the flooring, the classroom painting. There'll be a temporary controlled entrance. This is the only school without a controlled entrance. I say temporary because this is a difficult school to put a controlled entrance in because the office is in the middle. We still want to come back and see what we could do. We want to route everyone through the office. We will have that buffer, but it will not be through the office with this upgrade. There'll be some classroom doors replaced along with the keying. So for 50 years, we've had the same keying scheme. It's time to replace that and get a new key inventory there. The gym will see a new scoreboard. As long as we're taking the scoreboard down, let's get a coat of paint on the wall, and there'll be a new dividing curtain as well. The exterior, we've talked about the parking lot and bus chute. We continue to replace exterior doors there. The stadium has seen a lot of work, but not the actual concrete structures. So the restrooms, the team rooms, the press box will all get some attention this year. And if, as you go to Apollo, at door 2, which would be the capsule door, and at door 7, which is the activities entrance right into the commons, you'll see some signage with some branding for Apollo. These are always exciting pictures. We got a little bit of mechanical work here. We've got, it's a big building. We've split up the HVAC and roof work over a number of years. This should wrap it up there for this summer. Everything's torn apart and it will be back together by the time school starts. We've got a number of other projects. They're smaller, but still equally as important. A lot of these you've seen before. We're continuing, like the restroom work at Madison and Westwood. Westwood, we also need that carpeting in the media center has been there a long time. We're replacing that. Some more work in the South music rooms. Some of that same work from Lincoln last year's continued. Discovery's new this year where there'll be some flooring in some classrooms, but the big one's the exterior windows. Our Discovery Oak Hill and Talahi are coming up on 35 years old, so we need to start replacing some of those types of things. We're still talking about a few things. We know that with the increase in enrollment and the number of staff at Talahi, that we need to keep an eye on parking. And what we want to do is we want to get enough parking in the front of the building for visitors and families coming. So we're looking for some more parking solutions there. Right now, folks are parking on 12th Avenue Southeast, which is over by Selke Field. It's not ideal, but we're trying to get some on-site parking there. North is looking at the former pool area. That's the auxiliary gym to put a wall up between that and the weight room. And structurally, it would just work better. We're still looking into that. And then we did some playground inspections last year. Amy has reached out to the state to see if we can use some health and safety funds or some LTF funds to do some of those repairs. And we'd like to get some of those in this summer. Also at Talahi, we're looking at the lighting. In the morning, it can be kind of dark. It might just be a matter of kind of relamping those or changing the angle on lights. But we are looking into that. And this is an odd picture. Road construction, that's not us, but it impacts us. And so I just want to point out some areas that might be hard to get at. And when I say it's not us, but it impacts us, this morning we got a call from Kids Stop that they were over at Talahi and they had no water. All part of that project. So we do need to keep an eye on this. So University Avenue, all from Roosevelt Road all the way to 15th Avenue Southeast, which is just past Talahi, is under construction. If you've been in the north side of town, Madison and North are having some road reconstruction and sewer work, but I think the disruption to us is pretty well over on that. Out on County Road 1 and 120 by Walmart, there is reconstruction of a roundabout that's creating a few hassles for us for getting some of our students to summer school. We're just going to go with smaller vehicles to get them there. And then that bridge work out on County Road 75 is is about complete, so we won't have to hassle that. But just keep in mind, if you're going to any of our sites to check this out, it might be a little tough to get there. With that, any questions?
Scott?
One of the things that happened in the recent years was the change in the building code requiring storm shelters. What's happening at McKinley and Apollo as far as storm shelters?
For McKinley, that's part of the plan. It's worked into that new addition, and it will be constructed to meet code. At Apollo, since we are not adding on, the code doesn't apply at this point. Once we add on, then we'd need to apply that code.
I thought that the secured entrance was an add-on.
That's an interior modification. An add-on would be if we're adding on to the exterior of the building.
Okay, so when we start looking at storm shelter at Apollo, are we going to need a referendum to do that?
I think that those are the discussions that we'll be having, but I would say if we're adding on outside the building, we would need to comply with code, yeah.
And a storm shelter for 1,500 kids? 1,500 kids that we'd have to get in that storm shelter?
You know, I think those are discussions when we get to that, as far as, you know, where it's located and we'd have to look at what we have existing but I would say, yeah, with the code, it would need to hold quite a few people, whether it's kids or spectators.
Okay, so we need a referendum. Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions or comments? Al?
The only comment I have, Gary, is an exceptional job on the layout and presentation of the slideshow. Everything was really consistent and well-placed,
Thank you.
sized properly, looked really good.
Thank you.
Are you back in a couple months then in August for like an update on what finished and
Yeah,
stuff?
typically we do that
September?
in September.
September, okay.
And as we're going through transitions here, Joel's sitting behind me, we're already talking about what that might look like.
Okay, all right. Well, this is exciting. Thank you. Okay, then we're moving on to Board of Education Standing Committee reports. I believe we have two. We have Board Development Policy Governance Chair Scott Andreasen. Do you have a report?
The committee met on May 22nd, 2024. Assistant Superintendent Rivard presented board policies to the committee, and the following board policies were reviewed with recommendations to bring back for further discussion at a future meeting. Board Policy 505, distribution of non-school sponsored materials on school premises by students and employees. And Board Policy 512, school-sponsored student publications and activities. Board Policy 521, student disability non-discrimination, will be presented to the full board this evening for the first of three readings. Thank you.
Thanks. And then Board Finance and Audit Committee Chair Al Dahlgren.
Finance Committee met last Friday, May 31st. We had two items on the agenda. The first was the Apollo referendum update. Lori presented information regarding a potential future referendum for Apollo, including the reasons for a future referendum. Information was also presented on possible timelines, cost, and tax impact. Committee members will review the information and bring feedback and questions to the next Finance Committee meeting on June 11th. So it wasn't really a discussion, it was just some information presented to us that we can go back in the next meeting will be more of a discussion format. Then the second item was the 2024-25 preliminary budget. Amy reviewed it, and she's going to do so again in just a couple of minutes with the whole board, so I'm done.
Appreciate that. Okay, so looking for a motion to adjourn tonight's board meeting.
So move.
I'll do a motion by Scott, and Natalie, are you a second then? Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, regular board meeting is adjourned at 6:56 PM, and at that same time, we are opening up the Board of Education work session. We have 3 items tonight. First up, we have the preliminary 2024-25 budget presented by Amy Scalarud, Executive Director of Finance and Business Services.
Good evening, Chair Hawes, Superintendent Putnam, members of the board. So I'm not going to try to project because it's a lot of numbers on a little tiny screen, but you do all have a printed copy in front of you, and then there is an electronic copy in the board online agenda for anyone in the public who might be watching. In the interest of time, we are not going to go through every single page. We would be here all night. So we'll kind of hit the highlights, and we will start on page 4. So we always kind of jump right into what has been a topic of conversation for many years, and that's our cross-subsidy information. So on page 4, we have our special education cross-subsidy as well as our EL cross-subsidy. We do also have a third cross-subsidy that we'll be adding to this. We didn't have time between Board Finance Committee when we discussed it and tonight to get it in, but it will be added before the final approval, and that's our transportation cross-subsidy. As transportation costs have started to increase significantly, there's become kind of a third cross-subsidy hanging out there, and so we'll add some information to that. And when we get to the transportation fund, I'll provide some information about, kind of what that looks like for next year in terms of dollar amount. But as far as the special education and EL cross-subsidies, we've seen historically large increases year over year, and kind of consistent cross-subsidies, particularly in special education, and then a growing cross-subsidy in EL over the last 7 to 10 years. In special education, as we look at the readopted budget for 23-24, we see a nice move in the positive direction. We had about a $14 million cross-subsidy in 22-23, projecting that to drop to about $7.8 million for the year we just finished. That is a direct result of the additional cross-subsidy aid from the state. And so that's a movement in the right direction. But then as you see, as we jump to 24-25, we see it shoot right back up. The big reason for that is the delay in state funding. And so as we move through the budget for 24-25, we have some significant increases in special education costs that are projected for next year, both in staffing, as we have increased numbers of students and we have to add staff, as well as transportation costs. Some of that is additional routes to accommodate the increase in students, but just also a significant market-driven transportation increase. So as we see those costs increase, the way the special education fund formula funds is that we don't generate any new revenue on those new costs until the following year. So we should see this be somewhat, assuming costs stabilize into 25-26 and don't continue to grow significantly, which is a big if, right? Given our historical trend, that's maybe not a likely or realistic prediction, but if costs were stable and relatively consistent year over year, we would see that kind of drop back down to about that $8 million point as we get past next year and that funding comes in. So still at $8 million, even at the $9.2 million projected for next year, still considerably better than where we were sitting at the end of 22-23 at a $14 million cross subsidy, but certainly not fully funding or anywhere close to it. We also see that as our special education student count rises, it becomes a bigger percent of our budget. So looking back to 19-20, that was about 27% of our overall general and transportation spending, and that has now grown to about 32%. So almost a third of our general operating costs are directly related to special education. Moving down to the bottom, the EL cross subsidy. This is another area where the state targeted funds and tried to make some movement. And we see that again as a significant increase in that from 22-23 to 23-24, with that cross subsidy dropping by about $1 million. The way the state did the immediate budget relief for EL was an increase in the per pupil. However, the per pupil funding for EL is not tied to inflation. It's not tied to the formula. So again, as we move to 24-25, we don't see any more revenue coming because the per pupil amount is now fixed, but our costs increase year over year because we obviously have salary increases. So similar to special education, we see that while that means some good movement the right direction this year, we're going to see that trend back to a larger deficit next year. The good news with EL is that there is some cross-subsidy relief coming down the road that was approved by the legislature, but that doesn't kick in until fiscal 27, and so we're a little ways away from seeing that additional revenue come through. Flipping to page 5. The top half of page 5 is just some administration comparison. We won't go through all the districts. We just try to highlight some of the districts that would be comparable based on enrollment size. And always like to note that our cost per student for administrative costs are on the low end of what we typically see for comparable size districts. Then at the bottom, and I apologize that the top instructional staff isn't in. We had that updated and I must have grabbed the copy without it. That actual for 22-23 is just over 18, so consistent, and we actually found that 21-22 inadvertently had excluded some of our non-general fund staff, and so that was reflected higher than it should be. It should have been in that 18 area as well. And we see that we have pretty consistent staff to student ratios, particularly when we look at all licensed staff, that bottom ratio, watching that go down quite a bit over the years projected, and a lot of that has to do with that SPED staffing. So as SPED student numbers increase and SPED staff increase, we're going to have an overall total licensed staff to student ratio that's lower because we're adding staff in those areas, as well as staff that we've added from ESSER funds, compensatory funds, and other funding sources over the year. Page 6, the top half of page 6 is enrollment. There is a more detailed schedule in the back that we'll point out when we get to the end, but this is kind of a summary rolled up view, and you'll see we've kind of seen all variations over the years. We had some years of growth. We had a significant decrease from 19-20 through 21-22, which I like to call the COVID effect, which you'll see statewide. Just a lot of students switching to homeschools, public schools during that time. But you'll also notice that as we've kind of come off the other side of that, we've seen some increases, and we're projecting an increase, again, a small increase going into to next school year. The bottom of page 6 shows the revenue that we generate to support general fund operations. And this is just the general operating fund. This doesn't include transportation or operating capital or any of those things. But you'll see a significant shift. We're finally past kind of that last year of COVID relief ESSER funds. So comparing 23-24 to 24-25, we'll see that shift back between federal and state sources. Historically, 85% has been about our typical percent that comes from the state. In the last couple years, we've really seen that shift as the state funds have gone down and the federal funds have kind of taken that place. But we're back to quote unquote normal, if there is such a thing, and back to that 85% mark coming from state. The other thing I always like to point out on this page is just to draw attention to really what a small portion of our funding comes from property taxes. So for our district, that's just over 6%. Some districts that have lower special education and lower compensatory and lower state and federal funding will see that be higher, particularly if you have a large voter-approved operating referendum, which we all know we do not. So when we talk about how much of our budget really is supported by that tax impact, it's really quite minimal. And then page 7 shows our district as well as a state average in terms of spending per pupil. So going back to 17-18, you can see we've always kind of trended a little bit above that state average. A lot of that has to do with special education and EL and some of those additional funds. But across the years shown, you'll see both for us and the state average, a significant increase in per pupil spending. And again, that's both for us and statewide going to be primarily due to those COVID relief funds. So as there's been a lot of one-time money to support those additional expenses, our numbers are clearly still higher than the state average, and that's simply a factor of the amount of COVID relief funds that we received. Those funds, particularly the last couple of years of ESSER funds, are directly tied to free and reduced and demographic information. And so we see funds kind of across the state and seeing that increase the statewide average, but certainly not at every district. So now we're going to skip over the next few pages, which is really just a lot of information on the various funds, some financial summary information, and we'll look at the actual numbers of each fund individually. So we're going to skip way ahead to page 21. There's also an organizational section which starts on page 12. It has some information on fiscal policies, the budget process, reporting requirements, a lot of stuff that you can certainly read at your leisure. There is nothing new. So if you've read the book, cover to cover in the past, there is no changes to those sections. So I'll save you some time. But we'll start looking at the actual numbers then on page 21. So page 21 starts with the general fund. This is where the majority of our district activity takes place. And the general fund is actually comprised of 3 separate funds: the general operating fund, the transportation fund, and the operating capital fund. So we're going to focus on the 24-25 budget, but as we go through each fund, there's a multi-year presentation, and I'll just draw attention to a few of the things that may be significant shifts or differences from the previous year. So the general operating fund starts on page 22. And at the top section there for the revenues, if we scroll all the way over to that right column, is the 24-25 budget. And there's the actual dollar amounts again, where we can see that shift between state and federal revenue. Even with the significant increases in state revenue for special education and EL and the formula increases, in total, our revenue is still going down next year because of the significant amount of federal ESSER funds that were included in the 23-24 budget. We still have about a $2.5 million decrease in overall revenue because of that. The middle section there is the expenditures. There is a detailed breakdown on pages 23 to 25 that breaks each of these kind of high-level categories into a much greater level of detail. We are not going to spend the time to go through all of that. Certainly, if there's questions, we can look at specific numbers. The few things I'll just point out on the kind of summary level expenditure information here is special education. We can clearly see that large increase as we talk about needing to add staff and accommodate our student needs. Special education expenses are increasing from just over 39 million to about 42.5 million for next year. And then we see some large decreases in some other areas, notably sites and buildings and instructional support. And that's really, again, that effect of the offset of the federal funds. Those are the areas where we had some of those big one-time costs and one-time purchases that go away as we move into 24-25. The very bottom of the page then, the bottom far right corner, we see a total projected ending, projected fund balance for the operating fund at about 20.7 million. So continuing to project a healthy reserve balance. So we'll skip 23 to 25, because again, that's just that detailed breakdown of the expenditures. And we'll move to page 26. So this is the transportation fund. So the transportation fund in recent years, and this is really relatively new, within the last 2-3 years is that transportation cross subsidy. And we don't see it show up in the transportation fund because the transportation fund is meant to account for the transportation revenues that we generate and the associated costs. So it looks like we have a beautiful balanced transportation budget. But if you look back to page 25, right before, you'll see a transportation line that is in the general operating fund of about $1.5 million for this year. So that means that we're covering costs of transportation to the tune of $1.5 million in excess of the transportation specific revenue that we're getting from the state. Some of that is special education, again, because when our special education transportation costs increase, we don't see that revenue until the following year. But a lot of that is really just market-driven increases. We just came off of doing a renewal for transportation, and we're looking at about a 13% overall increase in rates and price, and that's consistent with the market. That's what we're hearing statewide, and it's really just based on the shortage in the market and wages and insurance and kind of all of those factors. So the transportation fund itself, again, a little misleading. This fund is intended to balance because it doesn't do any good for it to build up a multi-million-dollar negative balance. We make sure that the fund balances and then the operating fund is picking up that shortfall. And then going to page 27, this is the third and final component of the general fund, which is operating capital. So operating capital includes district capital, related purchases, technology and equipment, as well as our long-term facilities maintenance. And in the expenditure section, you can see it breaks it out between those areas. So kind of the general operating capital needs, any sort of facility leases that we have, and then that long-term facilities maintenance line is really the majority of what we have in our operating capital fund at this point. That accounts for about 8 of the $9.9 million in activity. The one thing I want to point out here, you will notice 23-24 has a readopted budget that has a deficit coming out of operating capital. That goes back to a while ago now when the board approved the improvements for the Apollo Stadium project last summer. Part of that was funded out of operating capital reserves, and so that's the activity from last July and August, spending down those reserves. We'll see a similar impact in the community education fund when we get there. So that was that one-time board-approved spend down for that project. Even with that, at the end of the year, we're projecting about a $2.1 million fund balance in operating capital. So again, healthy reserves there. We will then skip ahead to page 30 and look at our special revenue funds. We have 2 special revenue funds, food service and community service. Page 30 is food service, and food service is another area that we'll see a lot of fluctuation over the years because some of those effects of COVID and the funding related to it. So 21-22, you can see there was a big spike in both revenues and expenses, significantly more on the revenue side. That was the year that we received all meals free for all students, funded at the significantly higher federal summer food service rate. And so we also were fortunate to build a significant reserve that year to the tune of about $1.4 million, which we keep trying to spend, but doesn't seem to happen because we keep getting additional revenue as meals are free again and we're getting federal reimbursement rates for more of our meals than what we were. So we will continue to plan to spend that down. The state allows for about 3 months of operating expenditures in reserve. We are just over that threshold, but they have extended and implemented a 6-month approval through the end of next year. So we've got some time, and again, not a terrible amount that we have to spend. 22-23, we went back to all paid meals. or paid meals for those who don't qualify for free and reduced meals. And then 23, 24, and 24, 25, we've shifted to the state's universal meals plan. And for our district, that is primarily reflected in federal revenue because we are now CEP, the community eligibility provision, district-wide. With the state's universal meals bill, any school that qualifies must apply and participate in that program. We qualify as a district, and as a result, we get about over 95% of our revenue now coming at that federal rate. And so you'll see the 23, 24, and 24, 25 budget reflect a very small portion of revenue coming from the state, even though that perception is that the state is paying for free meals. In a lot of districts, that's the case. In our district, it's really primarily coming from federal revenue. Flipping to page 31, our community education fund. This is a fund that doesn't have a whole lot of fluctuation from COVID. There really wasn't a lot of financial impact on the community education fund. The only thing that there was some impact was with our after-school extended day programs. That's a program that we levy for the after-school care. There were some years where we were not operating and opening at full capacity, and so we levied the full amount, but we didn't spend it. And so we're still continuing to see some negative levy adjustments to take back those funds that are sitting in fund balance. So that is part of what you see in the 24-25 deficit. So we're projecting a deficit of about $225,000. Approximately $100,000 of that is that levy adjustment. So it's taking back that school age care revenue that's sitting in fund balance. The other $120,000 is the district share of the additional preschool for success classes that we've added to expand preschool the last few years. That is a partnership with Rotary. They are funding a portion of that. We had been funding our contribution to that with ESSER funds, which we know are gone for next year. So the preliminary plan is to take that, as of today, out of fund balance. We expect that there's a high likelihood with the state approving additional VPK seats in this most recent legislative session that we will get additional VPK seats and be able to shift some costs back to the general fund as we see that additional revenue. And the hope is that we wouldn't actually end up having to take that out of fund balance. But we know until we have an actual approval, we're not going to put anything in the budget that counts on revenue that we aren't 100% sure is going to come in. So that is the reason for the deficit spend for 24-25. Again, as I mentioned, similar to the operating capital, those deficits for 22-23 and 24-25 were that planned spending for the Apollo Stadium project. Similar to what we've said with most of our other funds, even with some of those planned spend down, we still have about $2.5 million projected in ending fund balance at the end of 24-25, kind of spread across the various community education components. So again, the fund is operating very healthy as well. Page 33 is Capital Projects Fund. At this point, the fund is really accounting for two things, which if you look at about 3/4 of the way down the bond proceeds line, we had the $15 million issued in 21-22 for that third and final wave of the HVAC projects. And then we had $15 million that was just recently issued in spending for all of the Apollo improvements that are happening this summer. So that deficit spending for 24-25 is just spending those proceeds for Apollo that came in the previous year. And then there will be some cleanup activity in 23-24. Still a significant portion of those HVAC projects is expenditures from last July and August for the last HVAC. The page 35 is the debt service fund. This fund is pretty straightforward. We don't control it a whole lot, other than if we had debt, which is generally voter approved. The long-term facilities maintenance debt is in here as well. The thing to note with this fund is it looks a little bit misleading right now because it looks like we're overspending. The budget has a $2.9 million deficit. The reason for that is because in 21-22, you see the large line for bond proceeds. We did a reissuance when rates were really low and advantageous to do a reissuance on the tech bond. However, most bonds, when you issue them, have a date that it's not callable and you can't pay it off before. For that bond, that's not until 2026. So until that date comes and we can actually pay off that bond, we sort of have both issuances kind of sitting out there. One of them we pay off of the annual levy, and the other comes from, it's worked into that issuance and it's paid out of those proceeds. When we finally hit 2026 and we can pay off the original tech bond, then we'll see this fund sort of go back to quote unquote normal. We'll skip the next few pages. That was the trust fund, which was used to account for scholarships. There was a change in regulation that required that to be rolled into the general fund a number of years back. So there's no recent activity in that fund. And then the last funds that we have for the district are on page 39. These are our internal service funds that account for various employee benefits. All of these funds have healthy fund balances. The only thing I will note is that you do see, again, a planned deficit for the health insurance internal service fund, and that was intentional. That was part of when we set the premiums for this year, planning to spend down some of those reserves. We built up a significant fund balance and reserve during the pandemic as we didn't have claims, and so we had intentionally tried to minimize that premium increase for employees and spend down some of that balance. There are detailed pages that show kind of that multi-year history on each of those funds. I'm not going to spend time going through those unless there's questions. And then page 43 starts the informational section. Page 44 is, again, that more detailed information on the enrollment projection, but it's really the same information we talked about at the beginning, just in a grade by grade breakdown. Page 45 shows the levy comparison. And while our dollar amount that we levy continues to increase, as we convert that to a tax rate, that tax rate continues to decrease because of two things: the significant increase in recent years in the tax capacity in our school district, as well as just the way that schools levy. So because we levy a dollar amount, and that dollar amount is set in legislation, unlike a city or a county that can set a rate, that dollar amount is fixed, and we sort of artificially convert that to a tax rate. So with kind of being restricted in terms of what that dollar amount can be, along with that increase in tax capacity, we've actually seen that tax rate over the 5 years decrease from about 26.4% to 21.2%. Now, that certainly doesn't mean that people are necessarily paying less school taxes, because we know valuations have increased, but we're definitely not getting the advantage that a city or a county would have as the capacities increase and it generates new revenue. That's just not simply the case for us. Page 46 is our staffing, 5 years of staffing levels. The one thing I want to point out is we've added a line for LPNs this year. We've always had LPN equivalent positions, but 23-24 was the first year that they were kind of called out in their own employee group. Prior to that, they were part of the paraprofessional group. So it's not that we haven't had equivalent positions, but prior to 23-24, when we look at the numbers, they are included in the paraeducator line. When we look at the actual bottom line, we're going down by about 15 staff going into next year, which was not a surprise, right? We knew we had some temporary ESSER-funded positions and some reductions that were going to come at the expiration of those funds. Page 47 is our activities comparison. We continue to increase and hold steady our spending on activities, and particularly at the junior high level. You'll see as we go into 24-25, a significant increase in transportation costs, again, directly tied to the number of routes that we have been running for activities this year, as well as those increased costs per route as we look at our new rates for next year. And then the last 2 pages are the curriculum review cycle, which is not my forte, so but I can assure you that we look at this cycle and we've worked collaboratively across the district to make sure that where we have content areas that are in review or going to be piloting or are going to need resources, that we have those costs identified and they are factored into the budget information you've just seen to make sure that we have the funding set aside going forward as we need new materials. So that is what I have. Unless there are questions, it's a lot of information.
A little bit.
Anybody have any questions, Scott? And then Al.
Okay, back on page 4. Under the special education and cross subsidy, you did a nice job of laying that out as being 32% of the revenue. But what percentage are we doing with the EL cross subsidy?
So the 32% is how much of our total budget we spend on special education. We don't show a comparable for EL because it's just not as significant of an amount. When we look at special education spending being almost $49 million, that's a substantial portion of our budget compared to EL at about $6.6 million. We just don't, we certainly could calculate that in terms of what that would be. But we've always shown it for special education just to draw attention to how much of our budget is directly tied to that and to something we have no control over, right? We have a little bit more control in EL, not that there aren't needs, but there's not as prescribed mandates and statutes that say you have to have 1 teacher per X number of students, or you have to provide this, or there's a little bit more flexibility, whereas the special education is really a mandate.
Okay, could you add that percentage into the EL anyway?
Yeah, we could add it.
I have a couple of questions, and they to do with the budget as they do with some of the narrative. On page 3, under dyslexia, in the second line, it states that, that the district screens all students, which we do, and then it says this is an unfunded mandate. Is it still unfunded? I thought this state picked up some of the cost of dyslexia.
So they're picking up some of the costs for the staff to be trained on how to do it, but from a permanent standpoint, there's not really permanent funding to cover the staff time to actually do the work or the materials. There is some one-time money that recently was approved for next year, but it's a very narrow parameters and it's not permanent funded. So you could say it right now it's sort of underfunded, but long-term it really is unfunded because a lot of what they've identified as the funding isn't permanent.
Okay. Page 8. Language on capital projects fund, it's talking about deferred maintenance in there, and we don't do deferred maintenance anymore. We do long-term facilities maintenance, correct?
So they still continue, if you're funding a bond, they still consider it a deferred maintenance portion through an alternative facilities bond. So the state still uses the term deferred maintenance in relation to the capital projects bonding fund. Because you could have deferred maintenance bonds that come from a capital bond. It wouldn't have to be part of the long-term facilities maintenance. You could issue a capital improvements bond using your operating capital revenue, or you could do a voter-approved bond for deferred maintenance. So we could certainly clarify that to say that, because it's not just deferred maintenance, right? It could be new construction. So we could add some language that
Maybe,
clarifies
yeah.
that, yep.
Okay, page 9, property taxes. There's a section in there that goes back to the 2001 Governor Ventura adjustments to how the state paid for things, or how the state picked up a larger portion of the cost of educating students. Are we ever going to drop that? This is going back 20 years ago.
We certainly could, yeah. Some of that I've just left in for historical context, but
Yeah, but
yeah,
the
if it's,
budget only goes back 5 years, and we're talking about something that occurred 20 years ago.
yeah, if it's
Doesn't-
not adding value, we could certainly take it out, and that might give us the room that we need to add the transportation cross subsidy without repage numbering everything. So I am not opposed to that.
I think that it's something that could probably come out.
I can do that.
And then lastly, on page 14, under fiscal management goals, it says in the district's fiscal management, the board will seek to achieve the following goals. And the first one is to establish levels of funding which will provide quality education for the district's students. I'm wondering how we do that, or if we actually allocate levels of funding to do that, because
Right. We don't really get to establish,
get to
or advocate
establish.
for is maybe,
we can advocate for,
Yeah.
or we can allocate, but we can't establish. And I just have an issue with that word.
would you rather see it allocate or advocate?
Both.
Okay, we'll put them both in.
Advocate and allocate.
Yep.
I think that's all I had for you. So. Now you guys should read that section because it's changed.
Okay, anybody else have any questions at all? All right, thank you very much for all your hard work putting that together. Okay, then, next up, we have the schools update, end-of-year celebrations, presented by Nikki Hansen, Assistant Superintendent of PK through 5 Education, Dr. Jason Harris, Assistant Superintendent of Secondary Education, and Dr. Mike Rivard, Assistant Superintendent of E12 Education Services.
All right, good evening, Chair Hawes, Superintendent Putnam, and members of the board. Tonight, we get to highlight many of the end-of-year celebrations across District 742. These pictures you are about to see are evidence of joy, curiosity, engagement, deep connections, and success of another great school year in St. Cloud Area School District. Our first school, here you see participating in their research gallery walk, our kindergartners planting flowers grown from seeds in their class, third grade field day of Talahi scholars who visited John's Arboretum. Is their community partner, Lincoln. Lincoln celebrated the end of the school year with inviting families in as students presented their state projects. Dressed for Career Day, that little lady in the bottom picture in her beautiful dress is dressed up as her teacher. Celebrating kitchen staff for all the yummy school lunches, an inventor's fair, and a school favorite, Pajama Day. The Oak Hill Owls celebrated Blast, which is a sponsored celebration and is a community favorite. Hosted their family fun night, Splash into Summer, and Principal Branton even got around in the dunk tank. A STEM night event, and their 5th graders performed 101 Dalmatians in partnership with Great Theater here in May. Clearview had a great time at their spring picnic, celebrated their growth and math accomplishments with Snarg, the iReady math mascot, had a glow party, and earned a PBIS celebration where they set up construction activities in their classrooms. At Kennedy, 4th graders went bowling. They hosted a spring student showcase that brought in record numbers of families to see the great work of their students, and the Junior Achievement Money Lessons were a hit. Discovery celebrated Earth Day, hosted Lego Club for after-school enrichment, had a 4th grade creativity challenge, and spent some time outside reading in the sunshine. Madison took their first graders to Quarry Park, celebrated with attended Yaya Young Authors, Young Artist event. Kinders off to a field trip. Our littlest learners from Quarry View celebrated their year of learning at their annual Spring Fling event. And that's a wrap for our end of the year celebration highlights for E5 education.
All right. Wow. Good evening, Chair Haas, Superintendent Putnam, board members. Just the last 2 weeks and just in the environments in our school and just what we've seen, my soul is full, right? Just all of it's a graduation, right? And so if we can just, North, we had a celebration to the end of the year. You see a staff student basketball game. All the kids were there, just having a great time. The environment felt great. They celebrated the students, and it was just a great common end of the year event for those folks. And so you just see it here. I just want to give numbers. 265 students completed their junior high career in 8th grade at North. And so that was a big combination of just ending one chapter. And so sometimes we forget about moving from ending middle school and going into high school and how big that is. And just in our time out, it just reaffirmed like that's a big step of leaving. I'm 12 to 13 years old. I'm leaving the environment I've been in probably since pre-K to go out and explore a new chapter. And so they celebrated it there. South Junior High School, same thing. They had the end of the year 8th grade celebration. You see the staff with their shirts on saying, hey, we're ready for the summer, to the students just showcasing all the talents within the school community and then celebrating it. And they had a kickball tournament end of the year by teams to see who could win and just all of that pieces. And so they finished with 290 students specifically completing their 8th grade celebration within South Junior High School.
Can I ask you a question?
Yep.
Did Principal Scalaboo join the kids against the staff? Was he coaching the kids?
So yes, so if you go back and you see Principal Scalaboo down here in the middle, the staff student game, he went over, to be a part of it, and then the kids seeing them, right? Like, so yes, and so they had a great time. Nobody get hurt. It was all good. We were talking about don't get out there. Yep, staff one, don't pull anything. We got to get to the end of the day just in that. So yes, you see it.
Tanner was on the team. That's how you justify that.
Yeah. So, just fun and our own, right? Like in there in the family and here, right? And so that's just awesome. And so just with finishing out South, they had 290 students just wrap up the chapter of 8th grade and getting ready for high school. And so in that. And then I got a chance to, superintendent was out. We got out to Kennedy to see the 8th grade celebration and graduation for those students. You see the students here just within the celebration of rollerblading and having fun and finishing out some art projects. We finished with 52 students that completed graduation at Kennedy. We need to talk about how our numbers are big with that, but total of 577 students that ended their careers and to a next chapter getting ready for high school. And so that's huge. Apollo, we were all there at graduation. Look how powerful this middle picture is where the Apollo graduates are touching the hands with the Madison students to create the vision that I could be there one day. That's a powerful picture. You see the celebration. The bilingual seal, we had 27 award bilingual seals given it to Apollo students. That's big. You saw the students at the senior lunch day and then award night where we gave thousands of dollars in scholarships away to students. And that's just a great way for our community to come together to give back to our students. And then let me just, how many? 300 walked across the stage for graduation at Apollo, so that's huge. We get to Tech, and same thing, we had 365 students who walked across the stage at graduation with the bilingual seal. You had 43 award winners around the bilingual seal. You had activity day. where all students came and just had a good time. And then McKinley, we got a chance to really have some fun with McKinley. McKinley had his biggest graduation class at almost 70 students, specifically within the makeup. And then they had the carnival. The student in the top left speech from McKinley was powerful. He just shared his whole journey, it's not just easy. We can't just say, hey, I'm going to go graduate from high school. Some things may get in the way. And that student shared his whole story in front of us, and I damn near cried because he put it out there, right? Lori, you sat right there, and I was like, okay. And so you see Bill, and they're just loving those kids, right? And so that's just a great thing. And we had just so 732 students total walked across our stages for graduation this year, and wrapping up a combination of the next step in their lives after they're just 12 years and preparing them. And so that's great. And then just activities. I know I'm missing some, but these were the ones that just popped out. We just had Trevor Moreau, Assistant Coach of the Year for our Crush Boys Tennis. I think it's about his 6th one, so that's just high notch. And then remember last year, right when I took over, we were talking about graduation and adaptive softball to make sure the dates are correct so we won't have any conflict. We worked through all of that. Our kids showcased and they got to the consolation championship, right? And so that was a real thing. And then shout out to Logan Anderson and just all around honors around that. So yeah, just a lot of great things that took place in those last couple of weeks in secondary land. And we should all be proud of all the things we all do I saw board member Idris, and we bumped in, had some hot dogs together. And so those environments just felt great as we ended the combination of the school year at secondary. So thanks.
Good evening, Chair Haas and Dr. Putnam and members of the board. So I'll wrap up some of our year celebration from the student services side. Our annual EL Excelling Student Award took place on April 30th at Apollo. Our EL department hosts this annual event every year with a dinner for our students and our family, along with our EL staff who do come and participate. The students are nominated by their EL teachers and acknowledged for each of their incredible growth during the 23-24 school year. It's incredibly well attended. On May 17th, we hosted again our annual track and field day for our students who participate in DAPE services, our Development Adaptive Physical Education. This occurred at Tech this year. This is an all-day event with students from Sauk Rapids and Sartell St. Stephen joining and participating with us. This event is an incredible celebration for our kids as they show some of their incredible gross motor growth and improvements, and kids walking around showing ribbons. It's a fantastic day. KJAC celebrated some graduations and grade level promotions with excitement. Students and staff also ended the year with some school fun with tug of war, and Ms. Blackmore made sure that I knew about the new playground that Gary spoke about earlier and wanted me to be sure that our board members saw that. That is truly a celebration for those students. They love it. On May 23rd, we hosted graduation for our Community Options Program, which serves our special education students between the ages of 18 and 22. CO2 continues to be located at St. Cloud State, with the ceremony happening at Atwood Center for 9 of our graduates this year. Their families were there, community members were there, and their worksite supervisors were there. I know Dr. Putnam was there with us for that event too. It's a heartwarming event to see those students achieve this graduation. And lastly, we see our adult basic education graduation ceremony. This year it did occur at Sauk Rapids Middle School on May 22nd. These 23 individuals are an incredible and inspiring group of kids, students, adults, who have worked very hard to achieve their goal of graduation. It's a heartwarming, it's a proud event for all of us from District 742. And that is our end of the year celebrations.
Thank you. Lots to celebrate. Al, did you?
Couple of things I wanted to say. Number one, I wish that ABE graduation is a great thing. I really wish that we could record that. I don't know if that's possible or not, but if we could record that and have an archive, especially of those speeches, because every year they are incredible speeches. They're very inspiring, and I think a lot of people would really enjoy seeing those if they could. I think my all-time favorite goes back to the guy that was 60-some years old and kicked out of the railroad because he didn't have a degree, and he came back to get his high school diploma. He gave a speech that was so inspiring. The other thing that I wanted to say, you guys also did a very good job of formatting and being consistent within the presentation itself, and it shows. It makes such a good-looking presentation. But the one thing that I noticed when I was looking at it, and I've noticed when I've been driving past Quarry View, is that one of our schools, and that's Quarry View, does not have a mascot. Every other school has a mascot. And I'm wondering if somehow, I don't want the school board to sit and pick what the mascot for the school is going to be. I think that should be derived at the school. And I know it's a difficult school to do that for because you've got big kids and you've got little tiny kids, but maybe it could be something like a Yogi and a Bubba type situation where the mascot was two, one big and one little. But I think that somehow that school should also have a mascot so that when we do presentations, they've got the same type of presence as all of the other schools.
I was thinking the same thing when I put it together. So it's on my long list. So I will get to that and come back for some good feedback.
Thank you.
All right, awesome, thank you. Okay, last up tonight, we have one policy reading. Dr. Mike Rivard, Assistant Superintendent of E12 Educations, will be presenting the first reading for proposed revised Board Policy 521, Student Disability Non-Discrimination.
Thank you again, Chair Hawes. So this evening, we're doing a brief review of board policy. We have no significant changes recommended from Board Development Committee and Administration. This policy was last reviewed in January of 2021, so we are up on a 3-year cycle for this. The purpose of this policy, as we see, is to protect students with disabilities from discrimination. And it's directly related to our students who are on a 504 plan from the Rehab Act of 1973. So as you may be aware, students who have 504 plans are students who have physical or major or mental impairment that limits one or more of their person's major life activities, and that we have record and we are working on helping them with accommodations for that disability. Where you see a minor change for this policy is changing Director of Student Services to Assistant Superintendent of E12 Education Service versus for who's the administrative liaison when these come forward. The major change that we're proposing for this policy is that at this point, the procedures are included in the entire policy, and action with Tracy and proposing this to board development, we made the determination to recommend pulling all of the procedures out of the policy. So that would be the change for 521. Are there any questions? Yes, those would be now included in the Administrative Procedures Manual. Thank you.
Looking good there? All right, thank you. Motion to adjourn tonight's work session. I have a motion by Natalie, a second by Scott. All in favor, say aye. Opposed? All right. Work session is adjourned. It is 7:49 PM. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Just a reminder, board members, we are here tomorrow, 5:30 PM for a closed work session for superintendent evaluation. And then our next board meeting is Monday, June 17th. So not Wednesday, because the 19th is a holiday. All right, have a good night.